I will. All right, well, glad that you are here. Our presenter today is our very own Roger Coffey, and I'm going to let him introduce himself, but we're so thrilled to have you, Roger, if you want to come on up here and speak with us.
Well, for those of you that don't know me, don't be disappointed. I'm not a speaker. I'm nervous at this. I'm like a traveling historical visual aid. Looking out, if we need to talk about the building or history or some of that kind of stuff. And so I want to start by, I asked Eva Marie, what do you want me to talk about? And she said, whatever you want, leave here. And I only have two topics that I know anything about to talk to you about. One would be how our 1929 building was built. So that would be one thing. And the second thing would be my 37 years as chair of the building committee and what we did during those 37 years. And I could maybe do a combination of those two things a little bit, I guess. But I want to ask, does anybody have any questions, things that you would like me to talk about or mention concerning either of those topics? Yes,
I do.
Yes.
Who really built this church? That's a serious question.
Who designed it? Who designed it?
Who designed it?
There you go.
Well, you're in a room with the Boston Avenue members, and we all feel Ada Robinson designed the building.
Thank you.
So, no question about that in anybody's mind.
I know you're gonna talk about the building partitions that you had helped design or did design. I've often wondered, and I was gonna ask you, what happens to your ideas? Are you going forth with some ideas with help, or what next? Because you've got some great stuff that you've added.
Well, as you know, I've been off the building committee for a few years, so I have not kept track of what they've done with any ideas that I had that were we had a list of things that we wanted to address or do with the building. And of course, funding always entered the picture on that. And so when I went off the building committee, we still had that list. The list never goes away. We just keep adding to it. And I honestly don't know what the status of all that is. So don't have an answer. I do know that we have embarked on cleaning up and restoring our stained glass windows in the sanctuary, and that's gone on. That was on our list for a long, long time. So that has happened. Yes, Jakes.
Yeah, that was what I was interested in, something short about what kind of restoration work is going on at the church right now.
Well, there is a company that we have done a lot of work with over the years from Fort Scott, Kansas. And they when you've got a church tower that leaks or a tall tower that needs attention, that's who you call. And they are just really great. So that's what's going on at the top of our tower is what the status of that is, I do not know, but I haven't seen a lot of the scaffoldings up there, but I haven't seen any activity in a while. So I don't know for sure where we are on that.
Do you know what they're doing?
No, I do not know what they're doing specifically. What we need to do is get Angela Sexton, who is now chair of the building committee. We need to get her, and she's an architect. we need to get Angela in here and talk about those few things. So Eva Marie, that would be a good follow-up to having, because I'm more historical at this point. Unfortunately. Very historical. Yes.
A while back, Lisa, who's been here longer than I have, was showing us like where the end of the the staircase was the end of the building. Are there pictures that show those earlier stages of the building before they were added on and the underdrive?
Yes.
In the archives?
I would say yes, there are a few of that. I can certainly remember when, as a teenager, we had car washes in Bishop's Hall. You know, and there's certainly pictures of that when it was a work-a-share, which you drove through. Now, where the main stair comes down into Bishop's Hall, that originally, there was a wall there with a big window. In fact, my grandmother always made a huge wreath every Christmas and they hung it on that window. And so when we enclosed Bishop's Hall, and that went away and we changed the stairwell. So now, of course, I mean, originally you turned to your left or you turned to your right when you got so far down the stair. And you can still see, if you look at it closely, you can see how the stair originally worked there. And of course, that we changed all that when we enclosed Bishop's Hall, which was when that was done.
Was that done at the same time the children's building was built?
Yes, it was. That was all done at the same time. Murray McCune, who was a longtime member of our church, was the architect for the children's building, and when we closed Bishop's Hall and did all of that.
That was just being finished. It just finished when we started.
Yeah.
Went to church here, so.
Okay. Anything else? Anybody? Okay. Well, there's a handout on the table which might help you with what I'm going to talk about. So, and on the back of it is a picture of the 1925 building committee. So I'm going to talk about that first because I said I'd do a little bit of history. So this is a little bit of history, and then I'm going to talk about the 37 years as chair of the building committee. This picture that is on the back is the 1925 and on building committee that basically was responsible for planning our original building, our 1929 building. The building committee was composed of 12 people. We actually had some women on it, which was a good thing because when we built our Fifth and Boston building, there were no women on the building committee, and we were highly criticized by the gals that were members of our church for not including women. So it's interesting that what you've got here, most of these names may not be very familiar to you, but I've got a little bit of background because a lot of these people were movers and shakers. They were all, of course, members of our church, but they were movers and shakers in Tulsa at the time. The chair was my grandfather, Christopher Columbus Cole. Off to his left is where it says J.R. Cole Jr. is my grandfather's older brother, James Reed Cole, my great uncle. He was chair of our building committee when our Fifth and Boston building was built and was already a member of our church when my grandfather came to Tulsa in 1903. And in fact, the reason my grandfather came to Tulsa was to go into business with his older brother, James Reed Cole Jr. So that was, I think, a good thing. Glad that happened. At the very top, we have H.G. Barnard, And then on the lower left, we have Mrs. F.P. Walter. Now, they were brother and sister, incidentally. And according to my grandmother, the Chapman Barnard Foundation, which is now Chapman Barnard Foundation, but at the time it was probably just the Barnard family, they were the biggest contributors to our church financially when we were trying to build our 1929 building. To the right of my grandfather's center picture is Mrs. J.M. Gillette. And our planning for our 1929 building started in her house, which, if you've ever heard any talk about the Gillette House or Gillette Mansion, which has been restored, I'm not sure who owns it now, but it's at approximately 15th and Lewis, set back from the corner. Of course, there was land around it. And so that was her brand. She had just finished her house and it was brand new. She was real proud of it. So the building committee met there originally. Mrs. Hagler, whose picture is right below my grandfather, is notable because her husband was one of two men that was responsible for the first bridge over the Arkansas River. We had no bridge until that time. And so and I believe it was a toll bridge even then when it was built, but that her husband was responsible for that. If you see the name Stansberry, he was a downtown property owner. And for a long time, longtime Tulsans may remember the Orpheum movie theater, that building where the Orpheum was owned by Stansberry, along with another building at 5th 512 South Main. And then the last one that maybe I could mention to you is Dr. Clinton, who's at the very bottom of the chart. He was responsible, one of the physicians that was responsible for our first hospital, which was opened in 1907. It had 10 rooms and 40 beds.
Was it Morningside?
I believe so. It eventually became, I don't think it was called Morningside originally, but I think it morphed into that, yes. So this was the group that was responsible. I have all these things to pass around and I hope it'll work. I always kind of fumble with these things, but so I'm going to start trying to get a little more organized with this. This first thing is a picture of my grandparents taken during the years that we were planning the building. That was in the 20s, the late 20s. It started in 1925. My grandparents were in their 40s at the time. And we don't have time to go into all the ramifications and the things that went on to get our building built, but a couple of things I want to share. These are copies of the original contracts for our building. My grandfather was responsible for actually writing these. I think one of them it appears to be a much more legal type document, and that's probably because his brother, we called him Uncle Jim, but James Reed, probably supervised the wording. He had a law degree. So this first one, my grandfather always typed all of his own stuff. And so I want to read this one paragraph to you that's in the center. This is the little short 1-page contract with Ada Robinson. And we paid her $5,000 initially. That was her fee. And it says, in addition to the services to be rendered by the above architects, we desire to secure your services, especially pertaining to all matters artistic, both as to interior finish and outside design. You to cooperate with the architects and represent us in all matters of this nature. So now the other interesting thing about this, so I'm going to pass these out together. The Rush, Endicott and Rush, who are our architects, their contract is much more lengthy. We paid them $25,000. Well, it's 5% not to exceed $25,000. We also say in that contract that this is for a building to cost $500,000 to $525,000 if it is to be done in brick. If we decide to do stone, it's $525,000 to $560,000. That was a big point of controversy when they were bid, and these contracts were all dated 1926. So they started meeting as a building committee, planning this in 25. So they got to the point where we had an architect, we had Ada Robinson. So there are those. This is a picture of, in those days, it was known as the Cole Building at 5th and Boston, the northwest corner of 5th and Boston. Of course, it doesn't look like that now. This is where Ada Robinson and the architects and my grandfather met because they had to find a neutral place to meet because the architects hated Ada Robinson and there was a lot of strife and controversy that went on. During the Depression, my grandfather lost this building and his offices with his brother were on the second floor. Here's the better picture of it.
Why was there conflict? Because they didn't want to change her ideas?
She was a woman.
Because number one, she was a woman. Number two, Endicott was a male chauvinist pig. He hated women, and he was the partner with Rush, Endicott and Rush that was in charge.
Was he married to one?
He was married, but he was also playing around, and he was well known. So he did not like being under her thumb. And she had the final say. She called the shots. And if they did something that she didn't like it didn't happen.
I heard something about the balcony when she was in the hospital and came back and said that's not the way it's going to be. And
Yeah, they had to rip the balcony railing totally out because she didn't like it. There was a number of things that were like that.
Go Ada.
At any rate, during the Depression, my grandfather lost this building, and what is there now is what First National Bank built in place of it. My grandfather, the sad thing was my grandfather was on the board of directors of the bank at the time. But those kinds of things happened to a lot of people during the Depression.
What kind of business did he have?
I'm sorry, what?
Your grandfather, what kind of business?
My grandfather was in real estate, but also lead and zinc mining. And we consider that maybe not a good thing because a lot of in eastern Oklahoma and Missouri, there is a lot of strip mining that was done. And some of that was my grandfather's business. So the lead and zinc and coal mining was a big part of his business. And then he had real estate properties all. Every time he and my grandmother moved, they had a house built as their very first place in Oklahoma. I mean, in Tulsa in 1907, and then they outgrew that house and they moved, and so they kept the house as a rental property, and then they moved, and so that And unlike a lot of us, when we move, we sell, but he somehow was able to hang on to his properties, and so he had these rental properties all over town, which I think was part of the reason that he was drafted to be chair of the building committee, because he had a lot of real estate experience with properties that he owned. When we and incidentally, these things that are in plastic folders, feel free to take them out. If you want to do that, just put them back in. When we finished the building and had our grand opening, this was what we did. This is what we passed out to everybody. It's a pretty fancy, a little elaborate booklet. The picture of the building committee that I showed you is in that little booklet. But there's also an article by my grandfather. There's an article by Dr. Rice. There's an article by Ada Robinson. So all of the key players that were involved have their say, have their words in there. In addition to that, there are floor plans of the building, the 1929 building, and pictures of it. So it was pretty, pretty elaborate. Okay. Now, what I want to do is shoot forward to 1978. Well, the first thing to back up from that, we have a building that costs $1.5 million, not $500,000, which is when they started is what they thought it was going to be. And the interesting thing that I find as an architect is such was the optimism. They embarked on that project. They didn't have complete drawings. They had a set of preliminaries, and that's it. And so it's gonna cost $500,000. No, we'll be fine. Instead, it was $1.5 million. And that was probably part of the story of how we almost lost the building. We sold our old church at 5th and Boston, yes.
Did they already own this land
They owned the land.
before?
Yeah, they had bought the land, and this was full of houses and little 2-story apartment buildings. It was covered with, it wasn't an open piece of land. In fact, one of the things that the building committee deals with is we have what is known as the classic sinkholes periodically in our parking lot. That's because when they tore all those structures down to build our building, they all had basements. And they didn't do a great job of filling those basements in. They're still there underneath our parking lot and around. So every once in a while, there's a little settling that goes on. And so that's the result of that. Anyway, we sold our 5th and Boston building to Wade Phillips, who many of you may not know was raised as a Methodist and so was very sympathetic to us. And he let us utilize our 5th and Boston church until our new building was done. It went rent-free, it didn't charge us anything. So he paid us $210,000. The congregation raised $240,000 as a whole by congregation. And $750,000 came from 3 families that contributed that chunk. So that put us at $1.2 million. We were $300,000 shy of having the building fully paid for. At the time, there was such an attitude of optimism and well, we can do this, that's nothing, we'll do it. Well, then the stock market crashed and things changed. So we almost lost our building, and if it hadn't been for the Lincoln Life Insurance Company in Lincoln, Nebraska, who agreed to give us a mortgage for the $300,000, we might have lost the building. But that was a happy outcome to that.
Roger, can you tell us who the 3 families were that were underwrote the big pact?
Well, we're always a little closed mouth about who it is.
Yeah.
I think it was certainly the Barnard family was one. I'm not sure, and the Cole family was one, and I'm not sure who the third family was, to tell you the truth, honestly. I think everybody did what they could, and so that was the important thing is,
Kind of makes them.
my grandparents, this kind of became a big thing to them, to be part of the project and to want to do it. And as the Depression rolled along, et cetera, they pretty much lost they lost their house, they lost everything they had. But, they were so very, very proud of our church and what happened in those years. The interesting thing and an outcome of all of this is today we have a 12-person building committee that meets once a month. We have $600 that is appropriated by our church budget that is for the building committee to spend. And I would say in all the years I was on the building committee, I'm not sure we may have dipped into it once or twice, but we never really used it. To be able to do any of the projects that I'm going to talk to you about, what we had to do was agree upon it as a building committee, get some competitive quotes out in the marketplace on what it was going to cost to do it. Then we had to go to the finance committee and get approval to do it. And then it went to the administrative board for final approval. So there was the whole process that you went through. Now, what happened in 1925 when we launched the 1929 building, I don't know. But I do know that they started off thinking they had a $500,000 project and they spent $1.5 million. So that had to be a very, and they didn't really know what it was going to cost until it was finished because it was being designed as it was being built. So that was quite an experience, I think, for everybody involved. And I think part of the reason that we today as a church, we're very, I don't want to say we're frugal, but we're very cautious with how we spend money, what we spend it on, and how we allocate it. And I think a lot of that goes back to what happened in the late 20s with building our original 1929 building. You learn from experience, and that experience has stayed. And although all the people directly involved are gone now, the memory is there of what we went through. So I think today we're very, very cautious of all of that. I got on the building committee in 1978, and I served on that building committee for 37 years. I was talked into being on it by a contractor who was a very good friend, Lee Butler, longtime member of our church, and his partner, John Mudd, who was also a member of our church. So if any of you knew the Mudds or the Butlers from those days, they enlisted me, and I thought, okay, I'm an architect, I can't dodge this, and it's something I need to do for my church, and I'm being asked to do this fine. And so the very first meeting, we talked for an hour about whether we could afford to add an electric outlet. Because we had there was no money for the building committee to do anything. In fact, those few years right in that period for our church, we had a tough time meeting our annual budget. In those days, for anybody that's been around a while, every year at budget time, the men Now, the women were not included, don't ask me why, but the men were asked to go to the little dining room. And you sat in the little dining room and cards were passed out. Each guy that came got a stack of cards. And these were people for us to call on individually to ask, will you make your pledge this year? I mean, you talk about embarrassing, it was, and you know, I just was horrified when I first was asked to do that, and I did do it, and to this day, I'm still horrified because the card would say what they gave the previous year and what, you know, what can you do this year, et cetera, all of that. It was horrible, horrible, horrible. And we had done that for years, and it wasn't until the Mouzon Biggs era that we got to the point where you made your pledge, you wrote it out, you sent it in, or you could drop it in a box at a service. And if you hadn't made your pledge by a certain date, then Dr. Biggs or someone else on staff would call you and ask you, you know, and put you on the spot. So that was a trademark of, and that worked.
Last week, I was cleaning out things at home, and I brought this to our Sunday school class last Sunday. When the church paper used to be a newspaper type.
Yes.
Thing. This was in 1989. The bottom half of the paper was the pledges, and every single Sunday school class was listed. Heritage class, number of families, 80% of them pledged. The highest pledge was this, the lowest pledge was this, and the total was this. For every single Sunday school class was on the front page of the paper.
We were here in 89.
That put the pressure.
Right after, so in 1978 and 79, those were my two first years on the building committee. In 1980, they decided they couldn't get rid of me, so they made me chair of the committee. and it was that year that I was in the parlor with Ron, who was our custodian. I don't know how many of you would remember Ron, a great guy. He was also a member of our church and his family. And we had a stash of full-size photographs of the pastors who had gone on to become bishops, and those were all they were nicely framed. They were languishing in the archives storage room because it was the typical thing. Bob McCormick had done these for the church, gave them to us as a gift, and then we couldn't decide where we wanted them. So we stuffed them in a storage room. Well, I mean, I thought that was horrible. I couldn't believe that. And we had a large parlor, which we still have, pretty much the same size, a little different, with nothing on the walls. There was not a thing on the walls in there, all this wall space. So I convinced the committee, let's dig those pictures out and we'll hang them in the parlor. Be a good thing. And so I talked them into it. And so Ron and I were hanging those in the parlor. And I looked up and here was this young couple with their 3 kids who had just walked in the room. It was Mouzon and Gail Biggs and their 3 kids. And it was the first time they had ever actually been inside our building. So to this day, you know, I would never forget that. And the Mouzon Biggs era was it was a wonderful time for anybody that served on our building committee because it was a very prosperous era for our church. We started with an endowment fund of maybe a couple of $100,000 and, you know, and somebody here probably knows exactly how much it is. I tell people, well, we've got over $20 million in various endowments, and I think it's more than that. So whatever it is, but that all came during the Mouzon Biggs era. One of the first things that he implemented was our TV ministries. We had never been on TV, or just occasionally on TV, but not on a regular basis. So that was his idea. Let's get on TV on a regular basis. So we did that deal with the what are we on? I can't remember. It's a 6, 8. We're on 8. And of course, as part of that, we also added TV lights that are up in the balcony, which there was a little bit of hue and cry about that, because all these big ugly lights, etc. The very first project I did in our sanctuary, which was right at the time all of this was going on, was Muzan came to me and said, we've got to do something about the altar table, which is, I call it a communion table, but it's where we keep our Bible. The angle, the height of the communion rail versus the height of the table, the communion rail blocked from the TV viewing angle, blocked the top of the Bible and the top of the table, and he wanted to raise the table. And I said, well, sure, we can do that. So I designed a base, which is there now. In fact, that's, if you'll notice, our ministers use it for cushions and kneeling cushions for them when we're doing communion. And the base had pegs in the corners, and we drilled holes in the legs of the communion table and slipped it on top of that base. So we pegged it in to do that. So that we made no change to the table, we just raised it about 6 to 8 inches. And so that was the first project, I think, that I really undertook in our sanctuary. Now, over the years, there were a lot of sanctuary projects that went on in increments. And I'm going to try to hit on some of those. And most of you probably, that's one of the spaces in the church that we're all very familiar with. And so over the years, we've noticed these things. We've recovered our chairs twice. Before all of this started, our chairs were beige. Does anybody remember the beige chairs? Everything in the sanctuary was beige. The carpet, the chairs, not much color. And of course, one of the things about the TV lighting was it bleached everything out in the room because the lighting is so strong. And there was some thought, we need to bring some color into the room. So we shopped all the major chair manufacturers in the country. American Seating provided the chairs from our original chairs. And the chairs we have are our original chairs. So it's just the fabric, the seating, and the upholstery underneath it in the back and the seat that it has been changed. But the frame and the backs are the original 1929. And my thinking is, and I don't know this for sure, and I don't think there's anybody that knows that, I think our Fifth and Boston church probably had pews. When we were planning our 1929 building, we were trying to be very modern and very contemporary. Well, we wanted to do theater seating, which is what we had, what that's called. So that was a big change for our congregation, but I'm almost positive that was a result of us wanting to be up to date and very modern. The interesting thing about the seating project was they had, there were two different ways they did it. We did this, I want to say there was like a 25-year span between the first time we had it done and then the second time we had it done. And American Seating had a huge truck, I guess for lack of a better explanation. if you visualize the biggest truck that you've ever tried to get around on when you're traveling, it's not big, you know, you can't say semi, it was bigger than that. I mean, this truck was like a moving van, saw one of those giant Mayflower moving vans, I mean, huge. They pulled that sucker up and then raised it so that it was right at the edge of our south porch. And they could carry rows of seats out through the narthex onto our south porch and into that truck and reupholster them and then bring them back in. And that was the way they did it. They only did that every day. They were able to do so many, and then they would bring them back in. So we were never limited on our seating in the sanctuary, although there may have been a time when a row or two were gone. But, you know, 90% of our seating was still there for us. And that was that whole thing with redoing the seats was because at the same time we were doing that, we were refinishing the backs. The wood in our sanctuary had gone through, in the 60s, it was very popular to have a blonde finish on oak and other woods. And so all of the staining in our sanctuary was very light. And all of that was refinished to be darker. And the way it is, it's the way it is now. I'm looking to see if anybody's asleep. It's even interesting to people. I hope it is. But there was another project that we did that all of these projects happened at various times, but we redid the seats in the choir. If anybody here that sang in the choir know that we had a problem with those seats banging when you sat down or when the choir stood and then it would bang. And the seats so all of the mechanism to get those seats to go to spring back up was replaced. At the same time, we recovered the choir seats. So that was another thing that we did. Because of the TV lighting, we redid all of the paint. There is approximately 10 different shades of pink and off-white in our sanctuary in various places. And so it's amazing, you know, where it all is. The interesting thing about all of that, and we did that because the TV lighting was bleaching, as I said, was bleaching everything out, and so we had to increase wherever we had color, we had to make it stronger. The ceiling was the real challenge, and we repainted it twice. The first time we repainted it, the painting contractor that we contacted said we have to have scaffolding over the entire room. And so you will not be able to worship in here. And I thought, oh my. And I thought, Dr. Biggs, maybe we could go to maybe use an auditorium like at Central High School. I mean, it was that long ago when that was still available to us. Which we had actually done in years past when an earlier sanctuary remodeling. Dr. Biggs said, no, we will have church in this room. And we did. We all stood. There was no place to sit. And we stood underneath the scaffolding. It was a short service, but we did it. And so the second time we did it, they had, and it was the same painting contractor, because we'd been happy with their previous work. They had a movable scaffolding. I mean, this stuff looked like a giant jungle gym, if you can imagine. And I mean, you know, we've got 40 feet to the center of our dome in our sanctuary space. So that's not a small thing to get people up there to paint it. But they had a movable scaffolding so that it would occupy like a quarter of the seating space at any time. And we basically just lost a quarter of our seating, wherever that was, but they could move it easily. They could knock it down. I mean, it wasn't easy, but they could take it down and then reassemble it and put it back up when they got ready to do another portion of the ceiling. The last time we redid the ceiling, we did gold leaf, replaced the gold leaf on the ceiling. And so any of you, the next time you're at church, if you weren't aware of the fact that on the edges of that design that's going on, A. Robinson design that's going on, the Art Deco design that's on the ceiling, the edges of each of those openings I want to say, call it a coffer for lack of a better term. The edge of that is gold leaf. So we have gold leaf all over our ceiling in the sanctuary. And that was the first time that had probably been replaced since the building had been built. We redid the carpet twice. Yes, ma'am.
Had Ada Robinson specified the colors of the upholstery fabrics? Was she responsible for the beige?
I honestly, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. So, don't know. I think originally it was actually not even beige. I think it was more like a light brown. The 1920, the beige was not the original fabric. It had been replaced. I'm not sure what the original was. We replaced the carpet. We've replaced it twice. The first carpet that we used was a custom wool. It was woven in Thailand. I had a source for that. They sent us little handfuls of threads of various colors, and all in that kind of, I'm going to use in layman's term, we have a very pale purple. Of course, it's not there. That is not the color. I mean, that's not what if we were with a firm of interior designers today, they would be horrified with that. Anyway, so we did that. And it was great. They did a great job. That was very involved because when you're ordering a custom carpet and we were doing the aisles around the back, all of that had to be measured. It had to be exact, et cetera. And it was, and they did a great job, the installers. The problem with that was one of my very old friends, and I will not tell you who it was, he said that she's the one that was responsible for the fact that we have an elevator in Jubilee big enough to take a casket out of our building because she didn't want people to have to carry it down a flight of stairs, which is what they had always done. She used to be on my case all the time about that carpet. The problem with the wool is, like any cut pile wool like that, it had a wave pattern in it. When the custodians would run the vacuums, there was this little bit of a ripple effect. Because anybody that's had carpet like that, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And to me, it was fine. I mean, I had no problem with. Well, there were people that were very upset about that. They did not like that. So we replaced the carpet. We have a synthetic nylon now. And of course it has no, I'm going to call that a grain pattern, whatever you want to say that is. We do not have that. And I've noticed it's already starting to show a little bit of wear and tear. But the interesting thing about our building is our building gets lots of use, and the spaces that we really use get a lot of people in them when we use it. And so there is a wear factor that we're always dealing with. when we do annual conference, we used to do it every other year back when one year it'd be in Oklahoma City and the next year it'd be at Boston Avenue. And we would spend months touching up paint and doing everything in the building to make sure our building was as fresh and looking good to get ready for an annual conference. And of course, then now it's been years since we've hosted an annual conference. So that's going to be a new experience for us. We went through a thing, it was right after, I'm going to pass this one around. This is in sections, you can unfold it, but I always got, you know, as Methodists, we like committees. Is there anybody in this room that has not served on a committee of something in our church? I mean, I'd be amazed if there were somebody. But we, you know, I think it goes back to John Wesley. I think John Wesley was big on us doing things in small groups. Well, that's what a committee is. It's a small group. Someone came up with the idea, I think they had been either to Trinity or what's the other Episcopal church on 41st?
St. John's.
St. John's. But they have needlepoint cushions in both of their worship spaces. So someone came up with the idea that we need to redo our communion rail and do needlepoint cushions. And there are enough people in the church that do needlepoint that, you know, this could be an in-house project and we could all do this. That caught fire. That was, we had a needlepoint committee. And of course, they put me on the committee. Well, I had never done anything like this. So what you're seeing here is what I did for the committee. But there were so many people that did, and I don't know if we had any men that actually did needlepoint or not. I'm sure we maybe had a few, but it was mostly women. We had tryouts. There were so many people, there are only so many cushions on the communion rail. And I bet we had twice as many people wanting to do needlepoint work as we had cushions. So that was quite a thing with the tryouts, and we hired this gal that had a needlepoint shop in London Square, I believe was where her shop was, or right over in there. I do not remember her name, but she was very helpful, and she took care of making sure that we had all the tools, the implements that we needed to have to do those cushions, which included, you know, threads and it's, you know, the right colors of thread picked out for each little thing that was done. So that was quite a project. We went through a thing. Fred Elder kind of ramrodded this, but we were trying to improve the acoustics in our sanctuary because it was too dead. We needed it to be a little more reverberation. People that we've got some music people in the room, I know. So you know, where your room, the ambience in the room leads to your whole experience with music. And the idea was we have cork under our seating. Well, the cork is the original cork, in case anybody wonders. It's kind of worn in some places, but that cork, let me tell you, it's lasted. That when you think that's been there since 1929. So, but cork is not a hard enough surface for what we needed. We had carpet. We had carpet all the way to the communion. I believe we had it all the way to the communion rail. So and the main walkway in the balcony, all of those places. And so the decision was made, we're going to do marble tile. We're going to do a hard surface floor in all these areas. And we went to Midwest Marble and we said, we need something we need a marble that's got some pink in it. Of course it had that pink in it. And so we picked out this marble. Well, marble, as we all know, is a natural material. no two marble tiles are the same. And you had to order this marble in boxes of 12. You got 12 squares to a box. And we bought a box, or we ordered a box just as a sample thing and went through it. Well, out of the 12, there would be 3 or 4 tiles that we really liked the grain pattern in the marble. And there would be others, we don't like that. So we ordered all the marble that we needed for this, and then we had to open the boxes. We had the boxes all laid out around the back of the sanctuary, and everybody went through the boxes. And the ones that were, because the grain pattern was pink and black and gray and off-white. That's what you had. Well, you can look at what we had down on the floor. That's what we had. And so we looked at each box, went through them, culled out the ones we wanted. And of course, we had to buy all of that, but that gave us some backup tile in case we had to replace some in the future. And that whole thing with the marble selection was a very, very interesting experience. Anybody have I'm going to move on to maybe another room. Any questions about the sanctuary that you might want to ask? Oh, I could talk about when we did the organ lofts. There was a little bit of a hue and cry about that. There were people that did not, that was a huge noticeable change in our sanctuary. And there were some people that just did not like that. And so, but the people that produced and I want to say, Sherry, I think it was, I want to say Moeller, but I won't swear to that. But I think they actually produced the wood encasement that's hung on the walls. And I was involved in that and some of the detail on that to make sure that we had a little bit of Art Deco pattern that went with it. Around the bottom of those is a little kind of pointed arch detail that runs around the bottom. And that's something Dr. Biggs always would point out to me. Oh, I'm so glad you did. And that was what he noticed out of that whole thing, is that little bit of thing on the bottom. And so that was the end of that. But at the time we did that, we had our choice of pipes. What color are these pipes going to be? Well, they could be silver, they could be gold, or we had I don't want to say black, but a dark bronze, dark bronze. And so you can look at what we have and see what you think. But I think, we wanted it to be attractive with the room and match, blend with what we had and yet not knock you down. So incrementally. Okay. Let's move on. We'll talk about the Great Hall as a project I did over the years. Now, incidentally, the little handout that had the picture of the building committee on one side, on the other side is a list of all the projects that I was directly involved in during my years as chair of the building committee. And so, we certainly don't have time to go into all of that, but I'm going to start this around. I'm running out of time, but maybe they'll let me go over a little bit here. There were probably 4 different projects in the Great Hall that over the years that I got involved in. Some were small, some were not, bigger. The door out of it's actually was intended as an exit door for the minister, which is directly in the center of the Great Hall. And so it's directly behind the organ. We added railings to that. It had never had railings. And apparently at a point, someone going in and out that door had slipped and fallen, or that almost did, and there was some concern about that. So we added those railings. Someone gave the church, I do not know, but it was a wonderful tapestry of hand-woven funeral pall. A pall is a fabric that covers a casket if one wants to do that for a funeral. And so it was quite large. It's really beautiful, and it had to be stored on a roller that was like any kind of fine linen or whatever. I think it's actually silk. And where do we put this? We had no place to put it, but it was a wonderful thing to have. Well, I came up with the idea, we have built-in banquettes. Does everybody know what a banquette is? It's a built-in bench along the sides of the Great Hall. So we decided, and those are solid. There's nothing in those for storage. So we opened one of those up, removed the masonry fill inside it, and kept the marble top and everything, and rebuilt it, and that worked great. And so one of those has our funeral pall in it. It's the storage for that. And when it's shut, you can't, you have no idea it's even there.
Can we open it and find it?
I know where it is, but I was sworn to secrecy.
Fred Elder, if you can catch Fred Elder, knows exactly where that is, because he worked with me on that. One of my earliest projects that we had, where we have these wonderful sconces on the wall in Great Hall. The sconces are etched glass, and they have fasteners that go through them that fasten them to the light fixture framework behind it. If your light bulb, we call them lamps in my business, but if one of the lamps burns out and you need to replace it, you have to remove the screws and take the glass off. And to get to it, to do that, put the new bulb in and screw it all back. Well, the problem with that is that glass is very, very fragile. And so we had a time when a number of those were having to be, the bulbs were having to be, the lamps replaced. And so the glass was being removed and then put back, and then they were screwing it back on. And when they would screw it, they would put the screws too tight. And if you did it too tight, the glass cracked. And we found out the hard way that the glass came from New Mexico. Of course, it was like everything else in our building, one of a kind. It was etched, etc. So, you first of all, you had to get a source for the glass. Then you had to go to a stained glass shop to have the etching design duplicated and done. I mean, that was quite a deal. So we learned very early on, you handle those screws very, very carefully. You don't do that. Another project that happened in Great Hall was removing the skylight covers, which were just thick with gradue. This is up on the roof. Cleaning those and fixing those so that we were getting light through the skylights. And I don't know if anybody was aware that we did that, but it made a huge difference in the amount of light that we got in Great Hall through those skylights. So that was the big thing. Now, the last thing that I want to mention in there was the mosaics. In 1992, and I think Dr. Biggs was probably the shogun on this, the guiding force that got us started. But we wanted to do something to celebrate the 100th anniversary of our church, which was 1993. And so we had a committee of course, for that. And guess what? I got on that committee. And so the decision was, let's have a mosaic at each end of the Great Hall. Because everybody that was a member of the church knew that those had originally been planned. Ada Robinson planned for there to be mosaics there, but we didn't have the money for the mosaics, so those never happened. But there was a big recess in the plaster on the wall at each end. So it was obvious that this was where we wanted to have the mosaic. So that was all well and good. So then we hooked up with Ziegler's. Does everybody familiar with who Ziegler's is? We hooked up with Ziegler's as a source to help us obtain an artist to do mosaics, and as a source to get the material here and to have them installed. So Ziegler's hooked us up with this artist out of Chicago. And he came and met with us, and that was good. And we brainstormed with him and told him what we were wanting to do. And so he left, and he came back with some prelims. I think he actually sent them to us. I don't know that I can't remember now whether he actually made another trip or not. But and we didn't like them. Part of the reason we didn't like him was he was a very fine artist, but he was Catholic. These were very Catholic mosaics. If you had them in Holy Family or someplace, they would have been perfect, but they were not Boston Avenue. They didn't reflect our Art Deco look that we wanted. And it was Dr. Biggs' idea to have one mosaic represent the Old Testament and one represent the New Testament. So being passed around the room, we sat as a committee and we brainstormed, well, what do we want in these mosaics? And we came up with, well, these are some concepts that we would like in each mosaic. These would be elements out of the New Testament, these would be elements out of the Old Testament, and this is kind of what we would like. And so sitting with the committee, I did on the back of a napkin, kind of a thumbnail sketch, which is what's going around the room, which was what we said, that's just a Xerox copy of what I did, but that's what we sent the artist and said, this is what we want. So then he came back with some very finished prelims, which are on the wall, I think, down right off Center Hall down there. And that's what we did. That's what we went with. Well, this is a fairly involved story, so I have to get through the rest of it, and this is probably the last thing I'm going to be able to talk to you about. But then we were all meeting with Dr. Biggs, and I can't remember how many people were on this committee, but we were all very excited about this. But how are we going to pay for it? Where's the money going to come from? I want to tell you, I am so grateful for Muzon Biggs for all he did for our church and for all those years and for him as a person. But Dr. Biggs could go out and raise a rock and find money under the rock. It was unbelievable. He said, I've got an idea what we can do. We had no idea what that idea was. Dr. Biggs went out to St. Francis Hospital, to Mrs. W.K. Warren's apartment. She lived out there full time. Her husband at that time was dead, but she was very, very feeble, very, very not in good shape, let's put it that way, towards the end of her life. And so he told her about our project and what we wanted to do, and that we had And we had estimates at that point that it was going to take $75,000 per mosaic to do these two, so that'd be $150,000. And she was very interested, and so he left, not knowing whether that was a successful visit with her or not. Now, the background of this story is what you have to realize is Mrs. W.K. Warren had 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son. And she had a prenup with her husband, who was Catholic, a very staunch Catholic. And Mrs. Warren was a long, long time member of our church. She had been a member before she married him. They had a prenup that the girls would all be raised in the Methodist church. And if they had a son, the son would be raised as Catholic. Well, they had 4 girls and 1 son. And the 4 girls were all married from Boston Avenue, raised here, married here. So 2 days later, a messenger arrived with a check for about $200,000 above and beyond what he had asked for. And it was from the 4 girls in honor of their mother. So that was a great deal. And so all of this, the tessera, the little pieces of ceramic came from Italy. That was all designed and done in Italy, and they brought it over, and Ziegler's actually installed it, and it came in rolls and sections, and they rolled it out on the floor of Great Hall. It had like a fish net kind of material on the back of it to hold the tile together. And so they would do a section at a time. Now, before they did that, they had to rebuild the recess in the wall because we were not sure whether that would actually hold the mosaic in place or not. I mean, you had plaster, but what was underneath it? Well, they had to remove all the plaster. There was clay tile underneath it, which is what most of our walls are. And they rebuild a substrate to be able to support the mosaic. And so that was all done first. So anyway, we have this all there. It's rolled out. It's on the floor. And then they install it in sections, and it all went up, and it's great. We were thrilled. And then they have to grout the joints and all that. I mean, it's like any kind of ceramic tile process. The one problem was we had wonderful chandeliers at each end of Great Hall. The chandeliers were done by the Empire Chandelier Company out of Sand Springs. They were done especially for our building, like most of our very decorative fixtures were. And so these very large Art Deco chandeliers, they were too low. They blocked the mosaics. So we had to actually, Harp Electric did that. We raised those chandeliers, if you can believe it, we raised them 6 feet from where they were. So that we had an unobstructed view of the mosaics and what they were. And then we had a big ribbon cutting, a big celebration when they were finished. And the daughters were all here. Mrs. Warren was not able to attend. Her health wouldn't let her, but she did come a couple of weeks later. She was in a wheelchair and she did get to see it. And then within a couple of months after that, she died. So that's the story of the mosaics. And I think it's 10 after, I believe. So I think I'm out of time, although I could talk to you for a couple of hours about all these projects, but at least that gave you a little bit of background. I have some interesting stories about Columbarium and Jubilee, which would be other major places or things in our building and Community Hall, but they'll have to be another time. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Roger. That was wonderful, very informative, and we will have you back. We do this every month. We'll find this
Any last question before I fade off?
Question. How did Ada, and I'm coming from another state, not been raised in Tulsa, been here a year. How did Ada have the prominence to take over and do all of this as a female back in 1929 or
Well,
27?
she was, first of all, she was a longtime art teacher in our public school system here and was
Okay.
very, very well respected for that. She had a secondary career as an artist and was very, very well known in art circles for her work in Tulsa. And she was known for working with people to help them understand what are you trying to say with your art and what are you trying to do, et cetera. My grandmother never knew her before all this happened, but she met her and was very impressed with her. My grandmother was a big fan of anything that had to do with the arts in Tulsa. So our church interviewed architects to do this big project, and several of them submitted designs, and the building committee didn't like any of those designs. They thought they were very ordinary. They were trying to do something other than another Gothic church, which is what the mainstream Protestant churches in downtown Tulsa, they all had Gothic. That's what you do when you can afford, you've grown to a point where you can afford to do that, et cetera. So my grandmother was so impressed with her that she talked my grandfather into letting her submit a set of prelims to the committee. And she actually went by my grandparents' house with these prelims and showed them to them. And as a result of that, they then called Dr. Rice in to look at that. And from there, it went to the building committee. And they said, this is what we want. So the idea that she could manage all of this and stay on top of this architectural firm, I don't have an answer for that. I know that she was a Quaker. She was very soft-spoken, but she was kind of like an internal steel. You didn't cross her, this is what it will be, and that's the way she was. So she stood up for herself, and she stood up for the design that she wanted all the way through on what happened here. And she was dealing with a very ego-driven firm of architects that wanted to put her down.
How old was she during this time?
I would say she was probably 40s. Early
Didn't have a
40s.
husband or a family?
Never married.
Never married?
She had a family.
How
She
many
had
years all
parents.
this, huh? I'm impressed.
She
The moment
became
I
a
walked
very-
in here, I felt a spirit.
She
I'm a
became,
strong-willed woman. I did.
well, became a very close
She's
friend.
here. Yes.
Very close friend of my grandmother's. In fact, I don't have it with me today, but I actually have a plaster cast of her right hand that my grandmother always kept in her living room. And because my grandmother admired her so much,
Yeah.
so.
Is that still at the Tulsa Historical Society?
Yeah, they're supposed to get it back to me, but I haven't got it back yet. Yes.
Is that display still up?
No, they took it down.
So, thank you. Yeah.
Well, and there is a book about her life too.
Yes, there is.
Is there
And
just
my-
one book?
Love to read that.
My grandmother was actually writing a book about her. I have all my grandmother's notes.
Wow.
But of course, that never had, it never got to that point. But, and I think it was called the Robin Flies South or something.
Oh, wow.
Her nickname was Robin. Some people called her Robin. Anybody else?
Do it again. The next step.
We should have been taping this